Where did that come from?
It's a new thing that you have to consent that you want to be recorded.
Wow. I like,
Yeah, so it
oh, what
pops
did I
up
do?
and yeah, it pops up and we have to say continue or leave meeting.
Yeah, that's not happened. So I was like, oh, did I get something different? You know, we've done some stories through the life of Joseph, and you know, if you remember way back when, the brothers came to Joseph, and he accused them of being spies, and he interviewed them and asked them all kind of questions about their dad and about their younger brother Benjamin, and then he said, then he kept Simeon and said, "Okay, he's going to be my prisoner until you come back and bring your younger brother." And of course, they get home, and Israel is going, "No, not going to do that. I mean, I've already lost Joseph. I can't lose him too." And so that kind of leads us to our story from God's word. So now the famine in the land was severe. And when Israel and his family had eaten all the grain that they had brought back from Egypt, Israel said, "Okay, go back and get a little food." And Judah said, "The man specifically warned us that if we come back without Benjamin, we will not see his face. So if you'll let Benjamin go back with us, we'll go. If not, we won't go, because he said we can't see him without Benjamin." Well, Israel said, "Why do you cause me all this trouble? What? Why did you even tell him you have a younger brother?" Well, they all joined in and said, "The man kept asking us about our family. He asked if our father was still alive. He asked if we had a younger brother. And we answered him accordingly. How were we supposed to know that he was going to say, 'Bring your younger brother here'?" So then Judah said to his father Israel, "Send the boy with me. We'll be on our way so that we will live and not die. Us and you and the rest of the family. I will be responsible for it. You can hold me personally accountable. And if something happens and I don't bring him back where he's standing before you, then I will be guilty before you forever." Now, look, if we had not delayed, we could already have been there and back 2 times. And that's our story from God's word, right? So let's work through this together here. So now the famine was severe in the land, and so what happened?
They eat up all the grain they have.
Yeah, when Israel and his family had eaten up all the grain they had, Israel made a suggestion.
Go back
to Egypt again.
Get a
Buy
little
some
bit.
more food.
Yeah, and get a little food. I find it interesting. He said, get a little food. Like, we're going to need more than that. And then who was it that responded to him?
Judah.
Yeah, it was Judah. And he said the man specifically did what?
Not to go back.
Told us?
Not to go back without your younger brother.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't bring the younger brother back, you're not going to
See my face.
See me face.
see my face. And he said, so if you'll do something, we'll go.
Let us
bring Benjamin.
Yeah, if you'll send Benjamin with us, we'll go. But
If not,
No, we won't go.
yeah, if not, then we won't go. And then he reiterates, he said, because
The man told
Man
us.
said we're not going to see his face.
The man told us not to come back before him without Benjamin. And so Israel said, yeah, you're right. I'm sorry.
No.
Why do you tell
Like,
them?
why do you bring this trouble to me or
Yeah,
something?
why are you causing me so much trouble? And yes, they said, why did you even tell him you had a brother? And then all the brothers responded and said, the man kept what?
Asking,
Asking us questions about our family.
how is your father? And do you have younger brother?
And we answered him,
Truthfully.
accordingly, truthfully. Yeah. And then they said, how
How are we supposed to
How
know
do
he's
we
going to
know?
ask us to bring our brother?
how in the world could we know that he was going to ask us to bring our brother back? And so Judah said to his father, send
Send the boy with me.
Benjamin with send boy.
Send the boy with me. We'll be on our way so that we will what?
Our lives.
Yeah. So that we'll live and not die.
Right.
Us and
You and the rest of the family.
and the rest of the family. And he said, I will be
responsible.
I'll be responsible. You can hold me
Accountable.
personally accountable. If I don't bring him back and he's standing in front of you,
I'm guilty.
For how long?
Forever.
Yeah, I'm guilty before you forever. If we hadn't
Delay?
Yeah, if we had delayed, we could have done what?
Twice.
Gone back
Yes.
three times
Yeah,
already.
we could have gone back and been back 2 different times, right? So now in learning that story, that for me, the end part, and again, this is not what I would do in a regular story time, okay? So I'm going outside of process here just so you understand, all right? But I'm trying to teach you guys some of the extra things. The last part of this story was a little bit harder to get, that last little paragraph where Judah is responding to Israel, because it was confusing. He said, I'm going to be responsible, I'll be accountable, I'll be guilty forever. And so, man, and especially because I got up at 5 o'clock this morning to really start reviewing that, and my brain was just kind of like, and so I kept looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, and so it was responsible,
Rag.
accountable, and guilty, and that's exactly what I did. Rag. So that way I could remember it. I made a little acrostic in my head: responsible, accountable, guilty forever. And so that was how I remembered those different, how I knew the order. Because what I was finding was I was getting confused. I would have them accountable, then responsible, or, I was interjecting the guilty forever at a different point, and I wasn't, because it kind of builds, in his response to his dad, it kind of builds. And so I just used that little acrostic in my head, R-A-G, to help me remember it. Now, I'm a literate learner. Right? I'm a highly literate learner. And I would just say, be careful if you go, if you're dealing with people that are more non-literate, because that little tool won't be nearly as effective with them. Okay. Yeah. But when we're teaching, we need to take into account everyone that we're teaching, right? And so for me, there are those times that I just have to do something. It's, if you remember back in, I don't know if they do this in China. I don't know how the Chinese language and alphabet works, but as a kid, like the word geography, we had a sentence that went along with that. George eats old gray rats and paints houses yellow. GEO, you know, and so that's we made a silly sentence that helped us to remember each letter that went with it. I'm probably dating myself. Nobody else is probably you know, endured that. And I'm not sure the way the Chinese alphabet works, if that same thing works there or not, don't we? But
We don't have, we have alphabet, but we don't memorize words like that.
okay, I didn't think so, because your alphabet, the symbols actually tell the alphabet itself tells a story, right? Is that
No.
the symbol
character.
mean something?
Yeah,
The character kind
the
of.
character,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I was thinking that was different. And so again, this is you see how I explain it to you all in one way, but somebody from a different linguistic background, different cultural background, different way of thinking, it might be a struggle for them.
So I see a doorknob, I mean, a doorknob for respond, and accountable, I see an abacus, and guilty, I see a gavel.
Okay. Yeah, and that would that would be more oral. So and so those are the things that as you're working with different people groups and different scenarios, you just kind of take into consideration about, okay, how can I help these people? Because there have been some places we have gone into that, boy, it's just really, really difficult. Just getting them to think in a more logical kind of way was hard, and we had to experiment and work at some things, and that's part of learning how to teach, right? Is taking into account the different backgrounds that people have. So, you know, we talked a little bit about how when they got back, when the brothers got back from Egypt and they gave the grain to their dad, and they said, hey, this guy in Egypt, he kept Simeon, and he said, he's not going to let him go until we bring our younger brother back with us. And so I wonder now, this has been a while, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but what do you think it might have been like for the brothers as far as their reaction to their dad, for him not being willing to send Benjamin and leaving Simeon as a prisoner? What might that have been like for the brothers?
They don't even, nobody mentions him. He doesn't even come up. It's kind of like, this is all about Benjamin. We got to bring the boy, but why did you tell him about the boy? There's no mention of like, oh, well, I can't lose 3 sons. So I think it's just like, once again, the invisible 10.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. The invisible 10. Somebody else, what do you think it might have been like to be those brothers?
The favoritism is still happening even after they get rid of Joseph. And it's funny, this morning at Caroline's group, we're talking about getting the earlier part of the story. So the brothers hated, you know, hated this guy. They want to get rid of him, but then now the dad is still favoriting. Like, it's still the same.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I think they are still very angry about the father, how he responds to the things. He don't care anyone else. No action in all these years.
Yeah, you know, every time I do one of these stories during this time of Israel's life, I'm just going, is he really going to be in heaven when I get there? You know, I mean, it's just like, if I didn't know the rest of the Bible having to do with Israel or Jacob, I just go, man, this dude ain't no way. You know, he is not going to heaven. But I mean, this is a guy we're going to be in eternity with, right? So how How strange is that? Well, let's look at the first part of the story. Uh, so the famine was severe in the land, and when Israel and his family had eaten all the grain that they brought back from Egypt, he said, "Hey, you guys go back to Egypt and buy a little food." And Judah responded to him and said, "The guy specifically said that we will not see his face unless we bring Benjamin back with us. So if you'll send Benjamin with us, we'll go. But if not, we won't go because he said we won't see him unless we have Benjamin." So we'll kind of stop right there. So just in this first part of the story where it says they've eaten all the grain and it's all gone. What kind of time frame do you see here in your mind as you hear that? I mean, do you see a short period, long period? So they've been back, they've been back from Egypt for
3
however
months,
long.
like
What was that, Noe?
maybe 3 months.
Okay, several months.
Yeah. It shouldn't be just 1 week.
Yeah, unless they're really eating a lot.
Oh,
But they also have a really big family. There's like wife and then more children. So how like they must be really stretching this food. Like they're eating like porridge every day.
Okay, yeah, or they brought back a lot. I mean, this is a long trip. If you could only go to the grocery store once every 4 or 5 months, would you load up?
I remember the family size is 70, right?
Yeah, I was just getting ready to say. I specifically did not add that to my introduction because I wanted us, we learned later on at the end, and I think we even did a story where it talked from the life of Joseph, where he brought his family members back, and they were right at 70. So that's a pretty good, that's a pretty good household.
I think it's a real balancing act because the prices are going to be high. So you don't want to buy so much grain at the really high prices. But also you got to be careful about bandits because a whole bunch of people are streaming down there, and it's like any other kind of a refugee situation. I mean, why else would you send all the brothers? They're apparently guarding the money on the way down and guarding the food on the way back. So this is kind of probably a somewhat dangerous trip because there've got to be bandits that are taking advantage of these people that are carrying their cash or carrying this very valuable grain. Either way, they're targets.
Yeah, because the famine is everywhere. So,
Yeah.
Well, so period of time, whether it's a couple of months, maybe a little longer, we're not told, but it's taken a while. So what might we learn about Israel from the fact that what motivates him to say, okay, it's time to go back?
They're starving.
Okay, yeah, they're starving. Could there have been other possible motivations for him to send them back?
Getting the son he doesn't care about.
Yeah, because while this has been going on, I mean, what's, and again, Diane, I think it was you that mentioned earlier, it's like Simeon just fell off the face of the earth. It's like who? Name's familiar, but
I mean, he's got to be married. There's got to be a wife and kids there
somewhere.
When's this old patriarch going to do something for my husband?
Yeah. So what might we learn about Israel from the fact that Simeon and rescuing Simeon was not a motivation, but we're out of food. Okay, you guys need to go back. What do you see about him? What's your impression of him? You want him to be your daddy?
Pretty like very detached.
Yeah, that's a great word. Very detached.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that really that identifies him pretty clearly as to what some of his major issues are. Well, I find it interesting. Who is it that speaks up in response to Israel's suggestion that they go back to Egypt?
Judah.
Judah.
Judah. So is he the oldest?
He's the fourth of Leah's sons. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if he's fourth or if there's some other boys in there.
Yeah, but there's a number of other, at least three, that are older than him. So what might we learn about Judah from the fact he has kind of become the spokesman here in this situation?
Kind of being regarded as a leader now.
Okay, all right. He's kind of become a leader. Yeah, we have to remember none of these guys is young. I mean, you know, he's got we know a story just before this. He's got two sons that were of marriageable age, and then a third son reached that point, right? Because he ended up sleeping with his daughter-in-law in the story that happened, you know, before all this. So this is not he's not a young dude, right? So the fact that he is speaking up to his father, I mean, what is your impression of him based on what he does here?
You know, I'm wondering if maybe Jacob is getting a little doty and indecisive in his old age. And, you know, Judah's just seeing, we got to do something. Somebody has to reason with this old man.
Well, you just mentioned something that I find very interesting. The Bible specifically in this part of the story calls him Israel, which, you know, is because in my mind he's still Jacob. You know, based on what he's doing here, he's very Jacob-like, right? But the fact that he's called Israel from this point on, I mean, you know, yeah, he might be getting doty, but what else stands out to you from the fact that he's not called Jacob, but he is called Israel?
I thought Jacob changed when he went back to Bethel, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so at that time, God changed his, not at that time, but God told him again, you are Israel, right? So
Yes.
I thought that's the high point of Jacob, that his spiritual walk should reach the high point. But how come getting old, just like the father, that Esau, all the father, when they get old, they just get confused. Oh, what happened?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yes, it says the voice of experience here. So
But I feel like it's maybe the Bible specifically call him Israel because he's out of his trick in this story.
Okay.
He's like, there's no trick he can think of. He's just like, oh, I can't do anything.
Yeah. Out of options. Well, you know, I like what you said that you know, his dad's kind of getting doty, but even though Judah is disagreeing with him, I mean, do we see Judah being disrespectful of him in his response?
No.
No, and he doesn't usurp he doesn't use and just like, Dad, we're just going to have to do this anyway. They're all trying to like, Dad, this has got to sink in. This is the only way.
Yeah, and he's pretty, I mean, he specifically, the guy told me, and the fact he says that 2 different times, I can see kind of what you're suggesting here is that maybe, Israel's elevator might not go all the way to the top floor at this point, or at least quickly. He's having a hard time grasping all the concepts. So then Israel's response to that is, why have you brought this trouble on me? Why did you even tell him you had another brother? To which the other brothers responded and said, listen, this guy was asking us all kind of questions about our family. He asked if our dad was still alive. He asked if we had another brother. And we just answered accordingly. How were we supposed to know? He was going to say, bring your brother back here. So what might we learn about Israel from the way he responds to it? Why have you brought this trouble on me? So, is he the only one experiencing trouble in this situation?
No.
He's thinking about himself.
Yeah, just thinking about himself. I mean, who else is having some difficulties?
Simeon.
Yeah. Simeon, I think, has got to be at the top of the list, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's you don't know, like maybe he's eating better than these guys because maybe prisoners eat better than guys that are trying to stretch out their grain, but you just don't know.
Yeah.
But to me, that first statement sounds like a father remembering the screw ups of his sons in the past, like bringing all that forward. Like, remember that thing with your sister? And, it's like, y'all are doing it again.
Yeah, it doesn't look like his sons have been the apple of his eye, at least not the 10. Right? Maybe the 2, but not the 10. Well, what do we learn about the brothers from the fact that I'm making an assumption here, but I'd like to hear your all's opinion. I kind of see them jumping to Judah's defense. So, I mean, what do you all see there?
I feel like, because they were there in Egypt, so they know how serious, this Egyptian man, and then so but then Israel wasn't there, so they're trying to all convince Israel, like, that guy meant business, like, really, it's not joking.
Yeah. There's not, it's not an option. So yeah.
It feels so real. Like nothing comes to mind, but I know I've done this. Someone's trying to convince someone else. I can see they're not believing it, but there's several of us that possess that same information. And we all go, no, really, they're right. That was exactly it. I mean, I've lived this, I don't know how many times, because it's just, it's how we work. Like, you got to understand this. We get it. This is our spokes guy, but really, we're with him.
Well, I think of my wife and myself, how many times have we been in situations where one of us has been someplace and the other one's like, well, why did you do that? But because we weren't there, and we didn't know all the background information. And there's almost that accusation in the way we ask the question, right? There's almost that accusation in the way my wife asked the question. I would never do that.
No.
But she's not here, so I can say that. So, yeah, obviously that's not true. That I've been, I was going to say just as guilty. The reality is probably more guilty, in that regard than her. And so then it moves on to the last part of the story where Judah says to his dad, listen, send the boy with me so that we may live and not die. You and us and our families. I'll be responsible for him. I'll be fully accountable for him. And if I shouldn't bring you back to stand before you, then I'll be guilty before you forever. But if we had not delayed, we could have already been there and back 2 times. So, now this is the one place where as I have the spiritual gift of sarcasm, which my wife does not think is a gift, by the way. But I can almost smell the sarcasm here, from Judah. Like, if we had delayed, we could have been there and back twice. Like, really, seriously, come on. There's no food, and now we got to get there. We got to get back. So, I mean, what do you sense about Judah as far as his response to his dad? Do you sense a building of frustration here?
Like, well, we've already determined that Simeon's not that important. So I don't know. Like, he's not concerned with him. He just doesn't want to waste his time. Like, he knows going without his brother is just going to be a fruitless trip, and he's already hungry, and so he's just like, I'll just let me. He's just trying to. We have to take him. That's the only way we're going to eat on this plan, because you're not coming up with another plan other than Egypt. So, so it's just like, yeah, there's a frustration of like, we can't go without him because it's just going to be a total waste of time,
Yeah. Well, and Mo, you bring something up that I think I hadn't thought about here before. Is anybody suggesting any other plans? I mean, is there anything else on the table?
No.
It's either go without Benjamin and come back empty-handed, or take Benjamin and come back with food and what's his name?
I think that shows his leadership too, because the last time you got food, at least me, I would think, okay, I need to go get food for however many months. And during that time, I'm going to try to come up with a plan to where I don't have to go back.
Yeah.
So it's going to run out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe they did. Maybe there's just no way. I've never been in a Phantom, but I'm sure it's difficult.
Yeah. Try to think of the other options. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, Diane.
Tough in that what Judah says is, I'll be responsible, I'll be accountable, I'll be guilty forever. But what he can't say is, I'll definitely bring back Benjamin and the other one, because he can't. All he can say is, I'll take that responsibility. But he's very powerless, and he admits it. He doesn't make an empty promise like, Dad, I'll absolutely bring back Benjamin, gonna get Simeon too, and get us enough food. He recognizes that all he can do is be the one that says, don't hate us all, just give the boy to me, and basically it's sort of, you can hate me instead of the rest.
Yeah.
He's just kind of really doing this for his brothers, because they're going to go, and instead of them all being responsible, he's just saying, go ahead, blame me if this doesn't work out, which is just miserable, as the thing to have to say.
Yeah. Well, I mean, might that tell us something about the brother's relationship to Israel? The fact that he's like, okay, somebody has to bite the bullet and be responsible. I mean, does that you see anything there relationship wise? Do you see them having a good relationship with their father?
I don't see an expectation of forgiveness.
Oh, okay. Build on that a little bit. That's,
that whole, I'll be the guilty one. You can hold me guilty forever. which seems to be, instead of you holding against all of us, really just until you die, that forever is really just, yeah, I don't think the brothers are going to hold him responsible. I think it's more of a you, Israel, for the rest of your life, instead of blaming it on all your boys and having a resentment. That's just kind of how I see it being. You can just blame me. That'll be simpler on you instead of having to spread it all around.
Yeah,
Oh,
and that kind of builds on what you had said earlier, about about Israel remembering all the screw ups that the boys had done earlier. And I kind of see here, this is a father who, I mean, he's got a long memory for things that were not done exactly the way he wanted, right? But when Judah responds there at the end and he says, "Hey, don't delay this anymore. We could have been there and back 2 different times." I mean, what do you sense there from Judah based on what, I mean, how he wraps up his conversation with his dad?
it almost feels like they probably among the brothers already have this conversation, like when somebody needs to go back, and then they're like tired of Israel not taking any action.
Yeah, like, okay, enough already. Yeah, we got to do something.
Been around and around and around and around.
Yeah, and now there's no food, so it's which you almost sense a little urgency here, right?
Well, they've got to have enough food to leave some behind, and they've still got that whole journey to get grain, and then they'll have some on the way back. But they've got to give the family enough for the whole time of the journey, and them for half of the journey.
Yeah, yeah.
But back to the previous question, where they about fine, Judah saying you can blame me, I'll be guilty forever. It almost feels like, I wonder if Israel is still nagging then, or holding grudges against them about Joseph, and then so they know, like, okay, this is a father who holds things forever.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder how that affected their relationship with their dad. I mean, again, does it seem like this family is kind of, I mean, they live together, but are they together?
No, they are just separated or divided.
Yeah, and that's, which to me is so interesting when you think about the rest of the story that's going to come because of this family. But at this point, even though they are together, they're it's kind of like, very tenuous.
The brothers are bonded. I just thought of this. The brothers are bonded in a lie, or
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, they're all holding a secret, so they're bonded by that, regardless, which is never good, So it's just.
Is Simeon one of Judah's full brothers?
He's number 2, I think.
I think he is, I believe. Which is interesting that Joseph chose him. That's, and I can't help but think, because we've done this story before, so I don't have any problem bringing this up, but I can't help but wonder, because Reuben was the one who tried, who was going to try to rescue him, Reuben being the oldest. So can't help but wonder if, like, he's going, all right, you were the second oldest and you didn't step up to the plate. But we're not told in the story, but can't help but wonder that. So, in this story, we have seen here at the end that this unforgiveness, this unwillingness to forget things that have been wronged against him, that Israel has kind of held on to that from what we can see in this story is, and it's impacted his whole family, right? I mean, does that kind of thing still go on today with with unforgiveness and I mean, does that still impact relationships? And what could that look like?
Just don't want to talk to that person, and if we have to talk, then we will escalate it just like this event.
Boy, that's a great, yeah, that whole escalation thing. It's kind of like instead of starting at the bottom, you start 3/4 of the way into the emotional trauma, right? Because it's, yeah, that's good.
I have a friend who's she married a man who was divorced, and he'd been divorced for, I don't know, now probably at least 20 years or more. And still all this unforgiveness on the part of the ex-wife. I'm like, good grief, why can't you just let that go? But just it's held on to it and has created a lot of misery for herself and tension with their son. I'm like, why on earth would you do that?
Yeah.
That takes such commitment to hold on to that. You got to nurse it, and it wants to die, but no, you just keep feeding it.
Water it and fertilize it. And Diane, that reminds me, I'm in the interim pastor of a lot of churches, a very traditional churches. And one of the things I've seen in those churches is that somebody has done something, one family has done something against another family or group of people in a church. And it's almost, in some churches, there are 4 or 5 churches in the church. This group is all about this, and this group is all about this, and this, they just don't forgive each other. And sometimes it's not even something that somebody that's alive has done. It's somebody who's been dead for a while that, they did it. And yet people still carry that negative emotional energy. And I'm curious, Dong, is that an issue in the Chinese church, that unforgiveness?
It's universal.
Yeah, it happens everywhere.
That answers my question. So,
Yeah.
So what are some of the issues that people struggle with in that context?
Mm. Yeah, I don't know about the result, but there's a couple who, the husband who gambled, and he just he borrowed a large sum of money, and then when the case when it is explode. Both of them are in the church, and when it exploded, he just ran away and leaving everything to his wife.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. His wife has to face all the debtors, and I don't know what's the follow up, but I know it is hard for the wife.
Oh, yeah.
And they just I think they divorced later. With well, the husband is not there, but she just filed a divorce.
Now, is divorce in China still relatively rare, or is it gotten to be like it is here in the States?
It's pretty close to maybe not so close to America, but it's close. It's very close now. That's what I know. Yeah.
I was afraid of that. Now I wonder, what is there about unforgiveness in this story that could help us in the future as far as our relationship, not just with the Lord, but with other believers or with our family?
Well, I could see that the result and the impact of unforgiveness is that to make the father, to separate the father and the sons, that's to destroy, the to damage the relationship. That's what I could see. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if we could learn the opposite here, that instead of allowing that unforgiveness to build, the importance of keeping relationships right, uh, of going after seeking forgiveness, of seeking to restore relationships early so that those things don't happen, that we have to deal with generations later. I wonder if that might be a lesson for those of us today.
But
So
I feel like for this story, like I don't even know, like the source is so far back.
yes,
It's not even the sons. Like I was thinking, oh, because Israel has favor, but then like he has favor because he was tricked into marry a woman he didn't want. So he had all these sons that he didn't, really care, and then because his uncle, the father-in-law tricked him, and it was like so far back, like it's.
well, and even before that, the thing that shocks me about Israel is we see the results of favoritism in his father and his mother, and he had to leave his home because of that, and yet he still practices that in his own life, which is a whole different issue of, like, man, how did you not learn that lesson? I mean, seriously, right? Like, your whole life is revolved around what your parents both did. Uh, so
And you think, he runs off, and I've known a number of people that had indifferent fathers, but they married someone whose father-in-law and their father-in-law recognized that gap and brought them in and made them more like a son, and not that distance. And so here he goes off and ends up with the brother of his wives, who is only self-interested.
yeah,
So it's kind of like he gets whammied twice.
yeah, yeah. Uh, well, this story is in Genesis chapter 43, verses 1 through 10. Uh, as I started preparing this story, I was like, wow, there's a I wish we had done this story earlier when we were doing some of the Joseph things, because, like, man, there's a lot of undercurrent here. Nothing just comes right out with a big sign saying but rather it's like, wow, if you start thinking about this, there's a lot of water under that bridge, as we would say here in the here in America. There's a lot of depth underneath the emotion that's going on. So
Can I ask a question
yeah, sure.
about the storytelling, like, right? Like this, because every time when I tell the Old Testament story, it looks like there's no solution for the dysfunctional family, right? We just talk about the favoritism didn't change,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So people will ask, what can we learn from the story? There's nothing we can, like a principle we can learn, so we don't do this. We will do and repeat it. Understand there's no hope.
Right. Right.
So how can I make the application there more?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Number one, what could we do differently? We see the results and the consequences of the unforgiveness here. What can we do as God's children to keep that from happening in our own families. The other issue I think that we didn't talk about, but that just really stood out to me, and I alluded to it earlier, but didn't go into great detail on it. The fact that Israel and this family are the bedrock of God's covenant people. Like, what? That just goes to show the grace of God.
Mm.
And so the fact that I'm going to be in heaven with Israel and with Reuben, who's taking advantage of his father's concubine, of Judah, who is sleeping with his with his daughter-in-law. Of these guys that slaughtered an entire city. I am going to be in eternity with these men. So what does that teach me about the grace of God?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And so that's one of the things you could do in an Old Testament story is, okay, man, honestly, I'm glad God's the one making the choices, because if it was up to me, those guys wouldn't be in. It's just because their actions have shown to me, like, how in the world could they be, and you have to be careful using the word Christians, but believers, covenant people, and yet God's grace, which, I haven't slaughtered a village, but I sure have gotten mad at somebody that cut me off, on the interstate. In my head, I've thought some pretty bad things. So to take that principle of looking at the grace of God, that God could use even these people. So the fact that God used Israel as a patriarch of his chosen nation, what might that show me about other people today? Should I be slow to judge? How should this affect how I respond to people that don't do things I like, or Christians who, like, Dong Wee, you're saying this guy, he was a gambler and he got into debt and he left his wife. My assumption there is this guy's not a believer and I'm not going to be with him in heaven. Right? Don't we all typically think that? But could this be a believer who just has really made a bad choice and got wrapped up in something he didn't know how to deal with, how to get out of? So again, a lesson to me would be, I need to be very quick or very slow to jump to judgment about people based on their actions or reactions to something. Right? So you do look for the principle there, and I always want to look for God's grace. Where do I see God here? In this story, I see God using Israel, even though Israel is, in my opinion, a total jerk. Right?
I also see, like, because I know a little bit, I haven't done a lot of the stories or from Israel, but I know a little bit about it. So it makes me want to go back and kind of run through it. But if you know it, or if you're doing it like as a series or whatever, this story for sure, like, I think with all of us, brings up all the past stuff, like all the way back to the father-in-law. I didn't even think about that. And I just, when you guys were talking about that, I was thinking about all the missed opportunities to, like, nip it, to just, and that's a good teaching too. Like, God's going to give you the opportunities, and, like, you can probably look at situations where, okay, I could have probably, diffused that
Yeah.
that time, but yet I'm still here, and now my son has to do, now it's falling on the sons. Like even back with the, the sons just being jealous of, the favoritism, just saying something about it, but that was an opportunity. And then instead they went another route and it just kept building. So, yeah, I definitely want to look at some more of that.
Yeah, Jason, and that reminds me, in talking to some of my other Chinese friends over the years, that respect for elders, which is something that I respect tremendously, because our culture used to have that, and we don't have it nearly like we did when I was a younger man. But how one of the lessons I could see in this story is how Judah disagrees with his dad, but he does it in a respectful way. But still, I mean, it's kind of pointed, like, man, there's no. He told me specifically, he's. I just feel it dripping with sarcasm, but he never crosses the line, of disrespect. It's more like, I'm disagreeing with you, Dad, but you're still my father. You're still the patriarch of the family. So that could be another way to go when you're telling the story, and especially, Flora, in your context of a culture that I would say, from my experience, values elders more than the culture in the West.
Yeah, I think they show the respect because they still wait their father to make the decision, not just go ahead, do whatever they want.
Yeah, we're going back. So, yeah.
I think we just kidnapped the
Yeah,
Benjamin.
kidnap the
Benjamin.
Benjamin.
Yeah.
Stupid
Save
father.
the family.
Well, and that was part of the discussion we didn't even get into, of other choices that they could have made, which a good storyteller would have probably led you into that. But I hadn't even thought about that till we just brought that up. And that is another choice they could have made.
This makes me think of some things that happened in my dad's church a few decades ago. And the county he was in was getting more people coming out from Richmond to this county that's adjacent to the city. That's still kind of rural, but it's experienced a lot of growth. And the church, a bunch of churches just said, we don't really want you people because you're just going to change things. So my dad's church, which was open to new people, began to grow. And then it went from being a certain size to being another size. And people that had been there a long time liking some of their traditions, other people like, yeah, you get to keep some, but we want to make some changes. And it all got kind of messy. And there was a bit of a split, and some people went from the church and went and started another church in another part of the county, not too far away. And they got that church started. And then after they got it started, they went, this is very nice, but actually I want to go home. And they were welcomed back into the church, even though meanwhile, the young minister who'd been there during this change had not handled that well. They brought in mediators from the denomination and we're kind of working on it, but he just, it was all just too personal. And he left and took a temporary non-preaching job and had an affair with a woman in that workplace and just kind of went off the rails. But his wife, after a little bit, came back to that church.
Wow. And
can you imagine, she could have felt really shamed, like, I'm tainted by this, even though she had nothing to do with it. It was purely him. not being able to handle what had happened. And she married again, and she and her husband have been there for many years now. But just that congregation was able to experience these hard wounds, but heal and remain open to new people. It didn't cause them to go, well, we've had enough of that. And they have continued to grow ever since. And I just see God's faithfulness in keeping them humble and open. And when those folks came back, they said, that was just tough on all of us. There was a thing that was happening. It wasn't that you were bad people. It wasn't that we were bad people. And I think as they saw all the things that went into building a new congregation and all the decisions you have to make and how hard it is to decide what that new community is going to look like, they went, I want to go home. It wasn't so bad there. And that new congregation thrived. And it was kind of like God didn't let that congregation be tainted by the fact that it was started by the malcontents.
Well, I mean, I'm Southern Baptist, and that's our church planting method, is to split churches. So, I mean, that's, kind of what we've done over the years. So, well, okay, I'm going to stop the recording.